Ladies and gentlemen, Mythic Plus is a big part of the game and we have 4 new affixes to mess with. Let's take a look. So this week brought with it 3 new Mythic Plus affixes that are going to be part of the core rotation, and last week we got to see the new seasonal affix Prideful that's going to be present of course in those Mythic Plus 10s, and we've had plenty of opportunity to jump into all the encounters, try them out with varying degrees of success. Let's talk about Prideful. Prideful is going to be a new seasonal affix. You're going to see it all the time if you're doing one of the higher level Mythic Plus runs, and it's a bit of a beast, certainly as the key level starts to rise. In general, every 20% of the trash you complete is going to spawn the Prideful enemy, and this is going to be a large red elemental monstrosity that you have to defeat. Now, it starts off weak, but then it starts pulsing and growing its damage. It's going to AoE the raid, it's going to do heavy tank damage, and it's also going to debuff one of the players with 4 arrows shooting out of their feet that after about 5 seconds, those will shoot out and they will stun whoever they hit. Now this week this was changed. So previously you could actually stand on the person who had the debuff so it would fire away from the group. That no longer works, you will be stunned. However, you can use spells like Mass Spell Reflect, anything that prevents stuns, so that you immune that aspect of it. Stunning the tank, not a good idea if you can avoid it at all. So you have to be very careful of where you're stood, and ideally anybody who has this debuff should stand still and allow the other people to modify their movement. Nothing worse than when the person with the Prideful arrows starts dancing around and you can't adjust your position to not get stunned. It's really quite bad. Now this thing does a lot of damage, guys, a lot of damage. It ramps up really fast. Once you start getting to your 15 keys, dragging this thing around in order to kill it near the next piece of trash is not a good idea. But that doesn't mean that you don't want to kill it and think about when you're going to spawn it and when it's actually going to die. Because for 1 minute after it dies, you are buffed, gaining a significant damage buff and also a huge mana regen buff, meaning that you can go straight into a boss with an enormous damage bonus. You can combine this with some of the Covenant specific abilities that are available inside the Mythic Plus dungeons to melt more of the dangerous bosses very, very quickly. Stacking these things up is huge. So Prideful is something you want to consider. You want to think about, when are we going to spawn it? When are we going to use it? And also, are we going to spawn it as we pull a brand new pack that has maybe a couple of low health enemies? And then we're going to have to deal with these high health, potentially very dangerous enemies with the Prideful mob, because that is almost a recipe for disaster. As I said, this thing hurts a hell of a lot and it scales very quickly. It's possible, remember this is still the beta, that it's doing too much damage. That might actually be the case and it's going to be toned back a little bit. But overall, this is fun. It's nice, it's very predictable, and you get this nice damage bonus that you can go straight into a boss with. There'll obviously be a lot of planning around the routes and which trash to kill in order to spawn this before you encounter something very dangerous. You also get that full mana regen, meaning your healers can go straight into the next encounter without any worries whatsoever about running or the fact that they might have been just healing the Prideful enemy. Just be very careful about spawning this thing in the middle of other trash, because that gets dangerous, or spawning it randomly where it's not useful. Part of the problem with this, of course, is the trash layout and the trash counts in the dungeons is a little all over the place right now. So if you look at something like the other side, you could spawn 3 Prideful enemies on your way to 1 boss without actually getting to use it on any boss or on any trash that is particularly dangerous, and it feels very wasteful. Similar with Necrotic Wake, you do so much trash so early, and then later on you're tied into a gauntlet, and this means that the Prideful enemy will likely spawn during a gauntlet where you cannot stop these dangerous large enemies coming into you. Blizzard may want to be careful about this, because it's kind of a wipe if that happens in most average groups, because there's nothing you can do. You can't stop the enemy spawning, and the Prideful enemy is coming anyway. You're going to have to deal with it in some way or another. Let's move on to the 3 new Mythic Plus affixes then. So we have Storming, we have Inspired, and we have Spiteful. Now what has been removed in favour of these is Teeming and Skittish. It looks like right now Teeming and Skittish is gone, and these 3 are going to be the new core rotational swaps in that you will get through your normal Mythic Plus dungeons. Let's start with Spiteful. So Spiteful will spawn an enemy, a little ghostly figure, after every single enemy you defeat. This does not include summoned enemies, nicely enough, alright? Or anything that has some sort of on-death effect. but it does include pretty much everything else. These things move fast and they fixate. They cannot be tanked. They will fixate on a random player and they go super fast, and they also kill you really, really quickly. Once again, this is beta. They may tune them down to be slower or do less damage, but right now, these are not a good idea to be tanking. No, 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 no. What you can do, though, is CC them. They also have very, very little HP, so the rest of the group can kill them fine as long as one person is kiting them away. Again, really depends on the trash pack that you're dealing with here. If you're dealing with a trash pack that has 2 or 3 really large, scary enemies and maybe 3 or 4 smaller, less lethal enemies, those things are going to die. They're going to spawn the spiteful ads. They can actually kill you rather than the trash pack itself if you're not careful. Several of the runs we had today involve the spiteful ads spawning in the middle of an already large pull and killing people outright, especially if you're melee and you don't notice you've got one. Good recommendations here is that you can CC them, you can slow them, and they kill themselves. This is very important. Although they have low health and you can DPS them down, they will kill themselves as their health drains while they're trying to chase people. So in many ways, you can kill a pack and just walk away from it, and the ads will try and chase you, slow them, do something, and you will never have to deal with them at all. Very easy to counter, very easy to manage, and also it's a very high chance that a weak aura will be made that puts a big silly face over any of the ads that are fixating you. So any of you who are worried that maybe that functionality was gone from BFA with your corruption, it's likely to be coming back. Let's talk about inspiring. You've seen this one before. It's the emissaries that we had halfway through BFA. In certain trash packs, you will have one enemy that is glowing. He is inspiring the rest of the pack. What does that mean? They cannot be CC'd. It's as simple as that. So you need to kill the inspiring mob in order to be able to interrupt and stun, slow any of the other mobs that you're dealing with at the time. Very similar to what we saw with the emissaries, Blizzard are carefully choosing where to put inspiring enemies. That means that some extremely dangerous trash packs have an inspiring enemy inside them. This is they're going to have to be worked around. This isn't something your average pug is going to be able to deal with. If we look at a fight like Halls of Atonement, the bears inside there are extremely dangerous. Why? They have a very nasty bleed, and they also gain a buff from their packmaster that makes them supremely do more damage. Of course, they've made one of those guys inspiring, so you can't slow the bears, you can't stun the bears. They're going to become huge, they're going to become buffed, you can't interrupt to stop the buff, and they're going to shred your party to pieces. This is what you're going to have to be careful with here. It is something you've dealt with before, so you'll know it when you see it, but just be careful of these inspired enemies. Honestly though, throughout our gameplay today, inspiring was the least relevant. It was the one that you could get away with ignoring for the most part. Of course, as your key scales much higher, then it's going to become a more difficult thing to deal with. But most of the time, this is actually fine. Let's move on to our final one then, which is Storming, which was easily the worst of the bunch, and that includes Prideful. Storming sucks. At least it sucks right now. I really hope there's some modification to this. If you guys ever done King's Rest and remember those little whirlwind mobs that spawn in the first big tomb room of King's Rest, that is now permanent throughout dungeons that have the Storming affix. All of the trash, all of the enemies while you're in combat, and seemingly even some friendly enemies while you're in combat, can spawn little tornadoes that spin around, do significant damage, and throw you up in the air. Now, I would say this. Right now, it seems that they spawn too quickly. If you're in combat for about 15 seconds with, say, 2 enemies, you're likely to see 4 tornadoes out of those guys. Very, very anti-melee. Could be that Storming is trying to disrupt the meta of bringing only melee classes in a lot of cases to Mythic Plus. That melee favoritism Mythic Plus has been around for a long, long time. Yes, I'm aware there are triple BM Hunter packs and things like that, but this is something that might try to break up that, bring the Demon Hunter, bring the Rogue, bring the Warrior, those kind of things, and bring more Warlocks, for example, which have seemingly been underrated in Mythic Plus for quite some time. That might be just guesswork, though. That's just a feeling you get when you're dealing with Storming, because Storming is really bad while you're melee. You could be chain thrown up regularly. If you get 3 or 4 mobs in combat, it's a lot of tornadoes. It's like 8 and then 12 tornadoes. They're all over the place. And one of the biggest issues with this is seemingly Storming hasn't been considered before the dungeons were made. And I say that because a lot of the Shadowlands dungeons have immense amounts of ground effects. Ground effects are prevalent throughout lots of the dungeons. That means that Storming on top of those already very readily happening ground effects just doesn't work in some cases. Regularly, while I was playing melee, I was just outside the pack and there was just no way of me getting back into combat. I had to just kind of range, throw things, fire death coils, that kind of stuff, because I can't get back in there. It's too dangerous, so I'm just going to die, and it's very clear that I'm not going to be able to be useful in any way, shape or form other than sucking away the healer's mana. Now, it might be a case that they're just spawning too frequently or they're doing too much damage. That might very much be the case, but even then, in some of the dungeons that have massive amounts of ground effects, these things just aren't... Fun is the wrong word. None of the Mythic Plus affixes are actually fun, in my words, but this is just really irritating. It's just not... It's painful. It's just something you don't want to play with. And there'll be certain dungeons, certainly with Storming, if it stays even similar to as it is now, that will just be kind of out. They'll be dead keys for most pugs because they're just a complete nightmare. It's not something you want to play around. You can't stop them, you can't stun them, and as soon as you get near a wall, you can't even see them coming. They're coming through walls and everything. And obviously the tank has to move around a lot. There are various bosses that you really need to heavily control the movement of that boss. And then Storming kind of throws that all out of the window. And I know some of you will say just play around it, but trust me, with the rate these things spawn and the damage they do, unlikely. Probably needs a little bit of adjustment to make it work. But I'm sure if you've done King's Rest, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So those are your new Mythic Pluses. Overall, Prideful, really quite fun. Quite like Prideful. It's interesting. It does a lot of damage. It's something you need to be careful of. It's not something that you can just pretend doesn't exist and then suddenly it spawns and you're okay. It's something that you have to be a little bit aware of, and some sort of counter, some sort of warning that you're going to get Prideful. And planning when you want to get the Prideful buff is going to be really excellent, because if you do it right, it's super fun. There's nothing better than going in and absolutely blasting with all the buffs and bloodlust and all that kind of stuff with this big damage bonus. That's really cool. When it comes to the new ones, Inspiring, it has potential to be horrible in very specific scenarios, but overall it's not particularly a big deal. I wouldn't care too much about that one. I think it's okay. When it comes to Spiteful, again, you can play around it. You see them happening, a little bit of extra damage, and as I said, you can just ignore them. You can actually just walk away from them and then no problem at all. Storming, though, is definitely the one to watch out for. I think Blizzard needs a little bit more work on this one, but as it's the first week it's been introduced, I don't think it's a big deal. So those are all your Mythic Plus changes to look forward to, guys. I hope that's been helpful. I'll see you again. Yes, I bought a light, so that's why my eyes are like that. Bye.